Well, it was a book. I read this book a few years ago about your mom.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and
Now that book, I helped to work with the writer. So I got an opportunity to help Barbara complete the book. And when we were going through it, now there were a lot of stuff I did not know that, Barbara had revealed from her conversations with my mother that were in the book. And that was like, wow, I didn't know that. I mean, that just totally shocked me. Now, I'll tell you what I didn't know that I discovered after her death. My mother attended Antioch College, still around in Yellow Springs, Ohio, liberal arts college. I did not know that my mother did not graduate in the 4 year, 6 year cycle that people, when they go to college, they graduate in. When my mother talked about Antioch, in her lifetime, you know, it just never came out that her matriculation was in that, successive time in getting her degree. I discovered after her death and when my sister passed, because my sister was over her estate, and then I was the person that took over her estate after my sister suddenly passed. I discovered in a box, her degree. And I looked at it and I said, I think it said 67, 1967. What? 1967? What is this story here? So I had to go on a search because I was puzzled and shocked. I thought my mother started school 44, 45, and she finished four. Actually, I thought she finished 4 years later. I then also discovered it was 6 years that she matriculated there. And she just left and went to New England Conservatory of Music. My logic was she graduated from Antioch and immediately went to New England. No, she finished Antioch after 6 years, which I didn't know it was even six. And then I had to ask her sister, who was still living after she died, what was that about? And she didn't really want to talk in detail about it because there were some things that happened when my mother was in college where she had to stand up for herself. And I don't think the administrators appreciated it at the time, even though this was a liberal arts college, they're a little bit more open. Um, my mother wanted to do her student teaching at the Yellow Springs, in the Yellow Springs school district, but it was still segregated. And she was upset about that. So she petitioned them. She then went to the president of the college, and the president of the college would not stand up for her. And she spoke out about it. And I think my aunt was feeling, even though she didn't tell me this is what I was sensing just by certain gestures and little bit that she was saying that, they mistreated Coretta,
mm,
or Corey, as she would call her. They mistreated her because it's like retaliatory. Well, I then discovered from a young lady who now works for us at the King Center as our Chief Research Education and Programs Officer, who's done extensive research on my mother, um, that my mother didn't pass this specific test at Antioch. Now, the test probably was a more subjective uh, um, grading because it was essay oriented. So you know how that goes.
right.
um, and that may be what my aunt's saying, that, they just didn't want to pass her even though she took it. But the test happened to be in the area, it wasn't directly these words, but this is what it was for that time, in the area of social change. So here you have this
Mm.
woman in the midst of this movement that is changing society, you know. And so I guess they said, well, we better give her her degree because we're not going to look, this is going to come back to
This
haunt
is
us.
going to historically look terrible.
Exactly.
Yeah. You said something interesting during the interview that in many ways your your mother was ahead of your father. Um,
Mhm.
in what ways did you mean that?
You know, they both were strategists in different ways, but I think he was so into the movement as the leader, he didn't have enough time to really step back and understand what needed to happen to ensure future generations um, would benefit from what they were doing. And so she had this insight and foresight to see so far off. And it started early on before the movement even got really going. She was already thinking something historical is happening and we need to capture this. So when he left to go make his speech with the Montgomery Improvement Association, he was preparing to make a speech as the president that night because that's when the organization was started and he was nominated to be president. And this was after the full day of the first day of the boycott. She told someone because she had just delivered my sister 2 weeks prior, yeah, and she told someone, birthed my sister. She told someone, take this tape recorder. The only reason we have that speech and those words today is because she insisted that that be recorded.
Mm.
So she was always like, we're in the midst of something. She knew it before him. That's what I'm saying. So in many ways, and then the Vietnam War, she was already a peace activist before they got married. And, was traveling. Once they got married, she went to international peace conferences, Switzerland and all over the place, and really encouraged him to lend his voice to their movement. She said, Martin, the peace movement needs your moral authority and your moral voice. And, I would hope you would, lend your voice. And, yes, there were other people talking to him about it, but I think because she was already there for years before they got married, and then by the time 67 got here, she was talking more about it. And she was the solid, single, steady voice and presence in that regard. That gave him the strength to stand because he was critiqued from you talking about cancel culture? He was canceled by all his colleagues in the civil rights movement. And this was public. The Johnson administration, started shifting newspapers. I mean, all of that. But my mother, again, is the one who was saying that. And then years later, she sees Henry Kissinger after that he's assassinated. And he pulls her to the side because I think I forget what role he was in I don't know if he was Secretary of State then. He said, Mrs. King, you all were right about Vietnam.
Mm.
So she just, if you look at, if you read the book, I tell people that book is a manual of how to do a lot of stuff in leadership and strategy, etc. She was very strategic in how she got my father's reputation and work recognized in the world. That 54 years later, we're still contending with it, looking at it globally, not just in our society, not just in the Black community, but globally. When I went to the Nobel Museum for an exhibit that we worked on with a curator about my father, which is the most comprehensive exhibit on his life and influence from before he was born to how his work impacted movements today. They revealed to me that out of all of their Nobel laureates, whether you're talking about chemistry, medicine, literature, etc., Dr. King is the most researched. And so, not just the most researched Peace Prize laureate, but all categories. And they said over 50% of the people who come to our website on a daily basis are looking for something about Martin Luther King.